Going live. Live on the
Doing
Facebook.
it. Doing it live on Facebook. Yeah. Doing it live on Facebook. Nope. Hey, welcome back to Testing Normal, everybody.
This is
Curtis.
Jordan.
Podcast where we talk about anything and everything we'd like to. And this is episode 63. 63. And we have a one-of-a-kind guest
Super
coming on
special
joining
guest.
us again today. We have the Mr. Austin Sailors from the motherland of San
The
Francisco,
motherland.
joining us. The land of
Yeah.
mothers, indeed. The Golden Gate motherland, one might call it.
One might.
One might, and then they would get punched.
One
It'd
might.
be kind of weird.
And one would probably
Yeah.
not call it that again.
Dude,
Good
so
to be here. Hey, guys.
thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Guys, what a crazy 2020.
2020 has been nuts.
What an insane 2020. Before we're gonna go over some like hot topics / sensitive topics / relevant topics, I guess I would say today. But first, I wanted to take the opportunity to throw down to you guys like some of the crazy stuff that's happened in 2020 so far.
Let's do that
I just
first.
wanted to throw it out there, like to put things into perspective, okay? So everybody probably remembers, but just to kind of recall, the Australian bushfire.
That was in
Basically,
2020?
That was
has
in
been very
2020, yeah. 2019 going into
overshadowed.
2020. Highly overshadowed. It was the largest fire in Australia ever. Burned estimated 18.6 million hectares, which basically I don't know exactly what that means, but it's
Is
a
that-
lot of acres.
I think
A
a
lot of
hectare is a
acres.
type of
Um,
koala bear.
yeah. I think that's technically
the,
true.
the hectares are
Yeah,
extinct,
sorry,
yeah.
hectares.
Yeah, the poor hectares are string. I don't know if you guys read up on this, but I remember reading about it. The Ukraine jetliner that crashed in Iran. Do you guys remember that? The Iranians
Oh,
shot
yeah.
down. Remember that? There was that jetliner that was flying out of
And that was
Iran,
2022?
and
What?
yeah, and it got
Oof.
shot down by one of the Iran bases. They thought it was like they thought it was a military base that was on high alert. So when the passenger plane took off, shot down, killed 167 people on board.
I do not remember that.
Been crazy.
No,
You don't remember
I
that?
do
I remember
kind of,
watching
but I
the
don't
video.
remember thinking it was
It was
in
recorded.
this year. It's so much has happened.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember that at all. I miss a lot of world news.
There's been crazy. There was those huge floods in Indonesia. It displaced over 400,000 people from their homes. Let's see, what were some of the other ones? There was that volcano that went off in the Philippines. Displaced a bunch of people from their homes. Kobe Bryant died in a helicopter crash. Let's see, locust. There's this crazy locust outbreak that's been going down in East Africa right now. Like city-sized swarms, like literally the size of cities, are being swarmed by these locusts.
I didn't know that.
And then, of course, we have this COVID outbreak.
Right.
I do
Which-
remember that one.
Which
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody
I'm-
recalls
I
that
have
situation.
vague memories of that.
It's technically still taking place, but that is all to be kind of overshadowed now as far as in media and people's conversations with the current social outcry we have of some of the horrendous murder that took place of a gentleman in Minneapolis, right? So we wanted to bring Austin on because he actually is part of an organization called LoveLab. And LoveLab, Austin, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. LoveLab is a community coalition, we say, but we do a lot of different stuff, but definitely a huge focus on connecting different disparate communities in San Francisco specifically. bringing some of our more privileged communities, like here it's the tech companies, the ones that have the resources and the power, to our more marginalized communities. So we do a lot of work kind of connecting tech companies with the unhoused population, and also like a lot of work around diversity, equity, and inclusion, or diversity, equity, and expansion, we would call it, for tech companies that care about creating a more inclusive environment, care about the community that they exist in. Um, and so yeah, we've done some talks about race, and so I think, yeah, I mean, it's not that we are, I don't want to, I guess, misrepresent like what we do. We're not doing any sort of like racial justice work in the sense that a lot of these other organizations are doing right now, but we have definitely spent a lot of time talking about racial justice and racism and unconscious bias, and trying to really help organizations and the communities that we're a part of figure out a way to talk about racism and to come together on it. So yeah, so I think, yeah, it's been like a really, really heavy week or so, since like George Floyd was murdered, and things have kind of blown up. And uh yeah, I'm happy to, yeah,
Well, first of all,
even like all, yeah, go ahead.
Well, first of all, I want to just throw out like people that are listening to podcasts. Like, we are three white dudes talking about this subject that is, it's relevant to all races and all ethnicities. And although we have not experienced the same degree of hardships that somebody of a minority has had to suffer through, I'm sure, in a lot of ways. I think it's not to downplay, like, it's still an important thing for no matter what your ethnicity is to talk about and recognize and think about. Yeah, so I wanted to throw that out there. If somebody's like, well,
Yeah,
there's three white dudes talking about it, I think it's important for everybody to be discussing it.
yeah, I'm really glad that you did. And I think, yeah, I was trying to kind of capture this, just the heavy feeling, and like how much more that's affected the people that I know that are in the Black community. And I think us being able to, well, a couple of things. One is that like it's really actually important that white people talk about white supremacy. If we want a power structure to change, it's like real, like either people that have no power are going to somehow rise up and take it, or the people that are in the power structure and care about changing it for more equality and more justice have to be the ones that kind of like lead in a lot of realms, lead the conversation, aren't scared to talk about it. And I think that it's really true that like this isn't a problem for the Black community. This is a problem for everybody and for our country and for humanity in general. And so it's, yeah, I think it's really crucial that we talk about it. I was just going to say, like, I think, we talked to my co-founder at LoveLab, Joseph, is a Black man, and we invited him to have this conversation with us today, but he didn't feel ready to have it. Like, he is experiencing a different level of like cognitive load, mental, emotional pain, grief, anger, all the feelings, and also like having to um, talk through that and explain it in like when he hasn't had time to process it himself, I think is tough. And then it's also just like, it's tough to be the person of color that has to be in the room educating white people or explaining their situation or kind of being the person that's going to bring their perspective in. And so it's really important, I think, that like we don't imagine that as three white dudes we can sit here and like solve the problem and understand all of it and whatever. But I think it's super important that we actually have these conversations where like we're not asking a person of color to join us and like bear the brunt of educating us and explaining their experience and going through everything, but we can actually talk about not what people of color are experiencing necessarily, but what this means for us and what kind of society we want to build and our part in white privilege and white supremacy and how we can dismantle that. And it's like these kind of conversations need to be happening a lot more, I think, where it's just white people talking about how can we change the system? How can we be better allies?
Well, I think as
Totally.
I was thinking about that, like we're like the issue that's up right now is like our broken system of people who are in authority that have hurt people. Like this very situation, like with police brutality, we know that in that, like, not all police do that, but there are some people who are awful that do. And the people to step out and to bring justice aren't the people that are doing bad, it's the people that are doing good. And I think that's a good way to think about it. Like, we don't ask our criminals to, you know, issue justice on our criminals. We do that as a society. So if someone looks in on this and says, "Well, I don't have this issue, so it's not my problem to talk about," well then you don't address anything else in your life like that either. A good question to ask is like, how can I be an example? How can I step in and have a good conversation? And what can I learn from this for myself? Because maybe I do have some things that are bad in my own heart towards this that maybe I don't see, that someone else, like either like you guys or any other friends that are affected by this differently, can help us to see. It's just good to get other perspective.
Yeah, completely. I think that one of our values at LoveLab is never them,
Mm-hmm.
always us. And I think like it can be a helpful. I think it's just important to think about how I guess I see this current of like us them
Yeah.
thinking throughout humanity. Like you could see it on all these different levels. And I think we obviously, like, white people found a way to do that with black people, and like literally with slavery and like on up. This like very like they're different, so like we can do whatever we want. We do that on a lot of different levels. Like I think you guys talk a lot about all kinds of different viewpoints and people coming together, and also like fracturing around politics or views. And I think you guys do a really good job of like questioning kind of the nuances of where people just
Mm-hmm.
sort themselves and are like, end of story, it's us versus them. It's like conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican, male, female, or like white versus non-white, or whatever it is. And I think like one of the interesting things that like we talk a lot about that at LoveLab, because our goal is to get away from any of the us them and to see everybody and all of humanity and like even like the planet
Right.
as a whole as an us. Like we're all
Mm-hmm.
this one
Totally.
thing, we're all part of
Right.
it, right? And I think something that's interesting at play here is the the system that we've set up with, I think, law enforcement and military, like by its very nature, and then by things that we've like done and contributed in ways that we've like turned our heads, we've created like the most intense us them mentality. Like police officers are trained to like, it's my partner, it's my guy, I got to be behind him. Like that dude stood there like watching his partner murder somebody in cold blood in broad daylight and did nothing. And like I've been wrestling with like, how could that guy, like how could either of the, like how could the guy kneeling on George Floyd's neck just keep kneeling on him for 9 minutes until they murdered him? Like how could the other guy just like stand there watching? And I think it is like, police officers are in dangerous situations a lot of the time, and there's like a lot of risk to that job and all of that goes into it. But then also like the philosophy is very much like it's us against everybody else, and we got to protect each other, we have to have each other's backs. And like that's why the prosecutors don't often bring charges against police officers, and why I think somebody could like stand there and say nothing while his partner
Yeah.
murdered a man,
Us versus them
because
kind
it's
of
like
thing.
it's the us, it's like the most intense us
Yeah.
them. Like you have to feel that as a police officer with like your precinct, your partner against everybody else to stay alive. But like I think as a society we idolize that kind of mentality, that hero idea, that like wartime, like it's us versus the
Right.
enemy. And like we let that permeate, and then it's really hard to get out of it. And like then we have places like our police officers where I think that's come to a pinpoint, like a really intense pinnacle of that kind of us them mentality that we prop up as a society. And it lets like what I would imagine, like I don't know,
Well,
I want to
it's
think that
interesting.
like there's a lot of good people that are just like caught up in that.
Yeah, and this is like a little bit of a step back, a little bit, but like just thinking historically, and it's not necessarily with race, but more so with like nationality. There's even like I guess you could call it like, I don't know, racism. I guess I don't know if that's specific to your ethnicity, but like when during the Cold War, when there was a lot of animosity between the United States and Russia, and it was like basically there was racism between each other, like you wanted, or even like with United States with Japan. Like there was racism
Yeah.
between each other during different wars and different times. But during the
Or like
Cold
another
War,
us them has been like capitalist versus communist. Like it was
yeah,
like not as
capitalist
much
versus communist.
racism, but it was like
Yeah,
the Reds, the commies,
it
like
wasn't as easy to
us them.
tell right? It wasn't easy to distinguish because there wasn't a specific color, right? But it was interesting because there was this quote I always love thinking about when President Ronald Reagan, he went to meet with Gorbachev, and he was the Russian president at that time, and they were like at the brink at that point, like it was right at the brink of like nuclear weapons being launched at each other, right? And President Reagan asked Gorbachev, he said, "What would you do if the United States were suddenly attacked by someone from outer space? Would you help us?"
What?
And yeah, he literally said that to him. And then Gorbachev said to him, he said, "No doubt about it, I would help." And then Reagan said, "We would too." And then as soon as
What
that
a
meeting
funny
ended,
question.
they I know, but like it was such a
Smart.
like
Yeah.
Really
it puts
smart.
things, it takes things from a micro scale to a macro
Right.
scale, right? And it helped them like take things out of this perspective of my country versus your country, my ethnicity versus your ethnicity, but like we're on the same freaking world. Have each other's back, man. That's it. I mean, it was a really kind of good summary of, even though it
Mhm.
takes things that it threw a bunch of people on these alien, conspiracy theories because Reagan started talking about aliens to another president. He's like, they're like, are there real aliens that are about to attack? What's
Right.
happening?
So
Um, but like,
Well, it's really smart because it's like a way, it's like a rhetorical device to get somebody to recognize that like it isn't us, not a them. Like it's a way to like get your mind realizing that like, oh shit, we are actually
yeah.
interconnected. Like if some other threat showed up, like we'd be with you. Like all it takes is like, and that's the annoying thing about humans is that like we're almost like it feels very evolutionarily or wired this way that we're like, as long as there's another them, then like I can be okay with us. But like if there's no other threat, I'm gonna find a way to like be separate and to like find a different group to be against, and to like find the in group to
Right.
be with.
so I think about with the the recent murder that took place. Um, you know, it regardless of how much race actually played a part in that situation or not, like I don't know the intentions of that cop's heart, right? I don't know what he was thinking, what he was feeling, whether it was actually a racial incentive behind it, or not. It still showed the fact that there are ways in which police reform, I believe, is
Yeah.
needed. And and it's kind of a blaring sore that you can see that the world is now recognizing, like, oh, that's terrible, and it amplifies and it reinforces the disparities we've seen with racism as well. But also, like, there's an obvious thing with racism that we need to just completely dissolve, but also reform within the legal approaches that people uh, get
Well, that's what I
approached
was going
by.
to
I
say
guess
is
I don't know
I
if that's
I
right.
know that this is highlighting that we need reform in law enforcement. And I think that that's true, but I think that it also is highlighting, at least in my mind, it's like if this is the only reason why he was able to have this, whether it was racial or not, I personally think that it was, just because of some things that I've read from his previous files and complaints and stuff, and even his partner, same thing, which is
Mm,
when you watch him, he just stands there like and doesn't do anything. They had multiple
well,
complaints with like racial things tied to them, and he had them at multiple jobs before. Like he had violent outbursts in like other jobs that he held, that they were like he just took things to another level really fast. Like it was like he didn't have like a meter. It just everything was 1,000 miles an hour or zero. And that's just not the kind of person that you want to have that kind of power. And
yeah.
so for me it's like I think that there are just as many people that aren't in law enforcement that have some of these same tendencies. They just aren't put in the situation where they're able to act like he did. And that's saying a lot. Like it's saying like that I recognize that there's a ton of people that have that. They just don't ever have the chance to act violently the way that he did.
So I'm gonna say something that might be a little
Nuh-uh.
controversial, um, but I wanna bounce it off you guys and see what you guys think. And those out there listening, let us know what you think too. Um, what do you think if we made law enforcement you have to be a minority to be in law enforcement. Would that solve? I mean, in my head, it just seems like a simple solution, and I'm sure there's things I'm missing, right? But that seems like a really simple solution to a big problem.
I think
If you have to be in a
I think
minority
the
race
problem,
to be able to be law enforcement, then you're not going
yeah,
to
but the
be.
problem with
I
that
don't know.
is like it's just like human nature is to pendulum swing. It's like we have, a dumb president, we have a crazy president, we have the people pendulum swing, and so the answer isn't just like whammo over here. The answer is like typically just pick any
Well,
subject.
okay,
It's like
walk me
it's
down.
somewhere in the center.
Walk me down. What would be the negative ramifications other than the jobs that would be lost, right, to hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people. What are the negative ramifications
Well,
of
I think
that?
you're doing the same thing, just the other direction. That's the problem. Like,
So you would say that's a form of racism
yeah, I would say that about anything. Like,
if you only had
if you
minorities.
try to like, like in the tiny town that I live in, if you were to like, hey, everyone has to half and half have, you know, this person and this person,
Well, and actually,
it wouldn't work.
it
You'd
might be
have no
staffing.
people. Like, you,
It might actually
and
not be
yeah,
enough in
exactly.
some locations, right?
That's where I go. And then
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know. Austin, you probably have a way better answer.
well, I was just gonna say, I think that like, I mean, I just think that it like, I mean,
It's
it's
an
an
interesting
interesting
thought,
thought
though, right?
experiment. It's like
It's like,
unfeasible in like, yeah, a lot of ways. Obviously, it's like a super extreme thing. I think a lot of places are talking about we want our police force to mirror our community. Like that's a really reasonable goal to be like, we should have about the
mm,
same
mm.
race and gender mix in our law enforcement as we have in the community that
Okay.
we serve. And so like if it's like an all white town, like that's fine. But like in a lot of cities, it's like really
Yeah.
disproportionate. And I think that, so like I think that that is a more reasonable version. But I think Curtis, your is like extreme example, but it is getting at, the reasons that companies and governments and schools and stuff are trying to increase diversity in the people that they bring in, is to say like this is a place of privilege and power that has historically been cut off from certain people based on their race, and so we're going to try to even the playing field and make this place of privilege, power, economic wealth, at least mirror the community that's right outside the door,
Yeah, I
which
think that's
Yeah.
a
is it really
That's a
important.
great
But
way to put it because when I've heard things like this poised, like I think Curtis's questions is an interesting thought experiment. I think in practice it would never work, but it's a good way to like think about like if you I like to think in extremes too. Like you push something to the extreme, what happens? Does it push it in a better direction or worse direction? Doesn't change anything at all. But what you had said is like it mirroring the area that you're in makes total sense. And then I was thinking like, well, what if like there was just heavy psyche vowels constantly on those people? Because I think what we just need is more kind people that are enforcing
Mhm.
laws. And
Well,
it
like we
sucks
don't hear
in
about
horrible
firemen.
people sometimes.
We don't hear about firemen. Like we don't hear about these sort of atrocities taking place between firemen. So it's like maybe just all firemen should be policemen.
Yeah.
No, I'm just
well, I
kidding.
mean, I
I'm
think
just kidding. That's just a joke. But
I think there's a big part of it is that like the police force is
Yeah.
militarized, like we started like spending all this money to like basically take military grade weapons and put that into our police force, and it was because of people who are on the margins. It was to keep people in line who are like people of color and people that are poor. And I think that there's like a lot of, I mean, you can just go back and back in like history of everything in this country, but especially with police force, there's like just like a lot of racially motivated policies. But just that militarization in general, like we don't need that. Like these people don't need to be going through training where they are. I mean, they need to be going through de-escalation training, not just like psyche
well,
valves, but like, you don't need the weapons that
so
you need. You don't need the like
I
um,
saw. Sorry, Austin. I didn't mean to interrupt. Go for
no,
it.
no, no, go.
Okay. I saw a really good kind of diagram about what would be a helpful kind of requirements that would potentially improve the approach that we have in law enforcement to just whether it's ethnicity or whether it's just human right and human decency. Um, one thing was I didn't know this, but one thing is that all police departments don't apparently have this, but they should create an independent. So there's 5 strategies. The first is create an independent inspector body to investigate police misconduct. So apparently within departments, sometimes it's their
Yeah,
own department that's
which
investigating
is
their own
ridiculous.
misconduct. So it's basically they're policing themselves, and by the very nature of that, you're going to have favor towards your buddy that you work day in and day out with. Now, granted, like that makes sense. This guy saved your life, so of course you're going to be like, nah, listen, he was just frustrated, let it go. But they wouldn't have that same leniency with the homeless person that they picked up off the street for doing a petty crime, you know. So there needs to be completely separate, independent inspector bodies for those police misconduct, right? The second one, and this was something that I'm surprised it's not already a requirement, is I think that states should establish board certification for law enforcement with minimum education and training requirements. So within Oregon, you know, like if you're going to be a nurse or federal even board certification, right? If you're going to be a nurse, you have to take board certifications, then you have to get certified within that state specifically, and then you have to meet specific very kind of strenuous training requirements. And all of that is to be said so that way if you don't meet those requirements and when you're actually practicing on the field, you can easily be sued for malpractice. Whereas within law enforcement, it's so hard to actually have to hold somebody accountable as far as litigious wise, because apparently I did quite a bit of research in this. So police departments have like one of the strongest unions. So if you try to go against somebody in the union, it's almost impossible within the police union. But then the other things that I was mentioning, you know, not having independent inspectors, all these different things really makes it more difficult. The next thing would be refocusing police resources or training. So like instead of training them to how do we kill a threat, how do we de-escalate this threat? You know, community building, that sort of stuff. And then the other thing that California did that I was surprised by, California adopted a change. So in many states, I didn't know this, lethal force is if it's at the will of what the police officer feels. If the police officer feels threatened, right? So if they feel threatened, then there's legal precedence that's out there that covers a lot of previous cases. So if a police officer felt threatened, that then allows them to institute lethal force on an individual. Whereas California just actually changed this law for them and specifically, and you have to have absolute, now they changed it to, it has to be an absolute necessity. Even if you felt threatened, was it absolutely necessary for that person to now die? No. So those are some of the changes that
I had a
I think
thought
would
while you
be
were saying all
effective.
that. It's like there's things that we
Yeah.
police way better than this, and one of them is like selling alcohol to minors. What if
Yeah.
we had like secret shoppers, like for police officers, like in certain areas?
Oh,
Well,
secret
Yeah,
criminals,
and
like
so they
undercover
had like
bro,
criminals.
an they had
so
like
risky,
no.
bro. No one's
Let's
signing up
say
for
they
that
had like a
job. You
they had a
could get
beacon
murdered.
that would fire off at a certain thing that would just like alert all the radios like next to them. But like if they got arrested, like say the secret shopper was the guy laying on the ground with something on his neck, and
So
all of a sudden it's like
good.
whammo, you've
That's
been caught,
so good, Jordan.
and then just he turns around,
That's
cuffed
great.
him, and takes
Bro.
him to prison. Like see ya, bye. Like
Love it. Love where your mind's at. I think couple problems with that is that, if you, I just think that I think one of the things that we don't necessarily realize is just like how scary it is to be a Black person in America interacting with the cops at all. Like just how many like kids with toys have been like shot. You know what I mean? Like there might not be time for the
yeah.
beacon. Like if you're a Black person, you're not signing up for that
So I
secret shopper
you, no
job,
no
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 matter how
I
much
I,
they're
I
paying
agree.
you.
You would
Because
have to
like,
Yeah.
be certain
Right.
situations, but like this one, it was a pretty routine thing that happened, and if it had ended up being someone else or something, um, you know, or the secret shopper is your partner, and they're just like deep cover, and they're like we're just because this guy
that
had
would be great. That would be
multiple
great.
like complaints against him, like he needs to go
Right.
away and never be
I
in
mean,
society again. Like that's what needs to happen to him.
I think that goes. I think couple of things on that. I think that like Curtis's points about accountability are huge. Like just the fact that we have such a powerful organization that can kill citizens
Right.
and doesn't have any like legitimate oversight, and the people that are making a decision on if somebody misbehaved or is going to get fired or is going to get charged like works with them every day, and like even the prosecutors, like in the most cases, like prosecutors rely on the police enforcement to make their case, to
Right.
do their job. Like they are on the same team on a day-to-day basis in order to do what they're supposed to do. And so to expect that person to then turn around and like be somewhat objective when they're charging a police officer is just insane. Like it's like the system is not set up to be fair. Like it hasn't been.
And like it's
Um,
it's like the IRS called you tomorrow and said, we don't think you paid everything, and you're like, oh, it's cool. I'm gonna self audit. I'll call you back tomorrow. And then you call them back and you're
right.
like, nope. Turns out you actually owe me $1,000. I overpaid you. And they're like, okay. Like they would
Yeah.
never do that, but when
So
it
Okay.
comes to
Fine.
themselves,
on the
Right.
on the daily, there was an interesting statistic they were giving out, and they were talking more for specifically for Minneapolis, but they're saying that in police firing, so if you're reprimanded and a police chief wants to fire you, um, it's remarkably difficult for them to keep you fired. Apparently, approximately 43% of people that are fired are rehired, have to be rehired by the because of certain laws that have passed that protect the rights, even if you've been fired as a policeman for atrocious atrocities. Not atrocity might sound
That's
like a crazy
insane.
word, but
It's
yeah,
insane. No, I think that's a good word. I think if you're in law enforcement and like the way that law enforcement in this country are able to harass and harm and murder innocent people with very little consequences is insane. I think atrocities is like an actual pretty good
and
word.
all of this to be said, like law enforcement would be a insanely freaking hard job, and it would be so difficult to constantly potentially be in positions where your life is potentially at threat. You're responding. You are frequently seeing people at their worst in a lot
yeah,
of situations, and or you're dealing with some people that want to see you harmed all the time. So I mean that's a weight that does grind on you. That's a really hard job
yeah,
to have. So I have the utmost respect for the fact that people are willing to serve like that, but the hard part is it feels like that responsibility of to protect and serve has been somewhat outbalanced by what seems like the the privilege of
I
authority.
would agree. Yeah, it's.
Mhm.
I mean, they've
And
taken that
I
off of
think
most
it's
cars.
helpful to think about these things on a
Yeah,
really
Yeah.
protect and serve. Mm. I think it's helpful to think about it from a systems perspective, like to think about, and I think um, there's a good on the podcast today explained. I think today there's an author that I've read a little bit of. His name's Ibrahim X Kendi, and he wrote a book called How to Not Be Racist, How to Be Anti-Racist. He talks a lot about being anti-racist, and I think one of the really helpful things that he does is just talk about it in terms of systems, and to say that like we need to get away from this, from using racist as a an identity or like a qualifier of who
mm,
a person is, because it just like creates defensiveness. Nobody wants to
Mhm.
be racist. It takes a lot to be like, and then I think if you start to talk about like, well, we're all racist and we all have racist tendencies, which I think is true, like it can kind of like just peanut butter over everything and like smooth it out to be like, okay, well, we're all racist, so like let's not talk about it. So it's like it's hard when you're talking about racism as like a thing that a person is, or like we are all at different times. But he talks about
Even if it's
the
subconsciously, you might not realize it, but yeah.
right. And so, I mean, I would say that. I would say, like, of course, we're all racist in a million different ways that we don't see all the
But
time.
it feels like such a
But
hard thing
that,
for people to hear that. That's what it's a if you've never heard that before, it feels hard for somebody to be like, "Oh, you're calling me
right.
racist."
You're
That's
like,
a
no, no,
hard
but
thing
of
to
course I'm not
understand.
racist. I see everybody.
Right.
Exactly. And his point is like, we can kind of throw that all out the window. It's not super a helpful conversation to have, and talk about being like racist or anti-racist is like, did I contribute to a thing that had a racist
mm,
outcome? So like if a hiring practice has a racist outcome, like you can look at the data and be like, oh yeah, so this is or like so like redlining back in the 60s or whatever, like the housing, like the very racist housing policy of like the way that they carved out neighborhoods. You can look at that and be like, oh, this had an extremely racist outcome. We see that. So that is like a racist thing. And like you are contributing to that if you're holding up that system. But if you are trying to change that system and fighting it, you are being anti-racist. And so he kind of sets up this thing of like, there are racist or not racist outcomes. Systems give us racist or not racist outcomes. And so to be anti-racist is you're like, you can be anti-racist in a moment when you're supporting a policy or a system that has an anti-racist outcome. And he was like, you can support something and you think it's great and you've like all got all the right intention. And then you find out later that it had a racist outcome and you have to be like, oh shit, like that had a racist outcome. So that was not good. Let's change it. And so it's not this personal thing where it's like, I can be supportive or not of racist and non-racist things all the time. And I may or may not even know it in the moment, but like, we have to do our work to find out if it like what the outcome was. And then like, if we want to be anti-racist, we have to commit to like changing those systems. And I think that's a helpful way to think about the police force, because it's like, yeah, there's obviously like this guy, I think it's almost, it's important. And I don't know, I feel like it can be a distraction to focus on. He has had all these complaints. He is just a bad guy. That guy's got to go. And not look at and then like throw out the fact that there's these systemic things at play and just like the very basic thing that there's no accountability, that like you can be a police officer easier than you can be like a mental health professional and move states. Like that's, there's a lot of systemic things that we need to change. And it's a more helpful conversation for us to have than trying to figure out the hearts and minds of each individual police officer or police officers in general. Like they're mostly great people, but then there's these bad apples. Like, okay, maybe, yeah, but like it doesn't really matter.
It's hard
like,
because it's like it seems like there's always this like not poisoning, but it's just a really seductive thing to have authority and to have power.
Yeah.
And so with great power or great authority comes great responsibility, right? But when you're dealing with such a large populace and you need such a large, to be able to support a community, you need to have so many officers. That's a really difficult thing, to find so many people that are that mature and that capable of handling that authority. And then to be able to do that, I think you also need to then incentivize it greater. If you're going to seek out the best, then you also need to have better incentives. So like law enforcement don't get paid very well, man. And so who's going to spend
even say totally, but I would even
3
say
years after college going to school to be a police officer if you know you're going to make $30,000 a year?
I think that's totally fair. I would say though too, it's like not even about, I don't even think it's about like finding the highest quality citizens to do it or whatever. It's like, I mean, there's so many things that you just mentioned around accountability. And I think you mentioned something about training too, but like, there's like these bullshit trainings. There's like this guy, this ex-military guy who does these like crazy assault I can't remember the name of him. He's made so much money around the country, like doing police officer trainings. There's no accountability on what his content is, how he approaches it, where it comes from. But it's like I wish I could remember the name of it. But it's like militaristic, like this is your target. How are you going to take them down? Training. That's like the way that we train the people, the system that we set up, and then even like how much we arm police officers. Like police officers don't need a gun in most situations. They don't,
right? Because like in England, most of them don't have one, right? Like
they don't have it.
I would probably push back on that, because as far as like this situation goes, this is a horrible situation. There's way more crime that's happening from the populace outside of law enforcement that is needing to keep people safe, and you need to at least have, unless we become a country, which I don't think we're going to without another civil war, we're not going to become a country where there aren't readily available weapons. They need to have something. I would say probably a more like moderate approach to that would be, don't push the militaristic training as much as they do. Push the other stuff more, like, because then that's the answer. Because there are situations where they need to know, like if there's a shooter, like I mean, sometimes it's kids, it's the school, and they need to have the training to be able to go in and do that.
Totally.
And so,
and you can't like completely disarm the police force or anything, but there's a lot of countries where not every cop has a gun, and that's not their only weapon. There's like 3 other things on their belt, from like, the bat to the taser. Like, why aren't cops tasing people more often? Like, it's insane that like this many people die in custody when like they have these other tools at their
Yeah.
disposal. And it doesn't mean like they can never have a gun. Like, okay, good luck. There's an active shooter, and like cops have guns. Like, I take your point on that for sure, but I just think that like there's so much that could be done in terms of like how we design the
Oh,
police
for sure.
force, who has weapons, who doesn't, community policing efforts. Like there's just so many things. And I would actually say on all that, there's this really great show on HBO. It's called Wyatt Cenac's Problem Areas. The guy's name is Wyatt. His last name Cenac. I'll give you the link so you can link it. But he does a whole season. It's like I don't know, like a John Oliver Colbert kind
Yeah.
of show, but he does a whole season on policing. And there's like 8 episodes or whatever, but he tackles a lot of the things that Curtis just mentioned of like all the like the top things that could
Oh,
be
yeah.
changed. And has like a lot of research and like stuff behind it, and a lot of cops that are like really invested in these like different community policing models that are incredibly successful and are not fully armed for their day-to-day
Well, and I think
stuff.
that's part of the problem too, is our police force is considered paramilitary. And so what they do is a lot of the people that are coming in there are actually encouraged to be military, but that's a totally different style of training. I've been through that. It's
Yep.
when they're out there,
Yeah, that's
then
interesting.
that's the threat because you're in war. Like when you're going to those situations, it's
Right.
life
Right.
death. It's the guy next to you. It doesn't matter what he looks like. He could be a chicken. Like that's you like you're with him, and out there is the enemy, and no matter what you do, it's going to get hurt.
And
But
you
the
don't even
problem is
recognize them if they're not part of your
right. And
citizenship.
so the problem is when you bring that home and you do that here, I think that a lot of those guys could be really good at it, but you have to have a calm, cool, like situation. I think honestly, the best people in the world to be police officers, hands down, would be, if they're coming out of the military at least, would be drill sergeants. Because they are taught to not use force that is above what's been given to them, and they can stand through the most crazy things without like breaking like into anger. I mean, and they shoulder it really well. Whereas a lot of those guys, it's just run and gun. Like they don't get that type of training. But that's specific, and there's some other areas that do too. They go through specific training where they're basically getting beat up and they're not allowed to attack back, and they're trained to turn that
Mm.
on when it needs to be
Well,
and not turn it on when it can't, when
what
it doesn't
was
need to be.
what was the name of the presidential candidate that was wanting to do the wanting to bring out the UBI, Universal Basic
Andrew
Income?
Yang,
Andrew Young, or was it
you racist.
Andrew Yang? Yeah, Andrew Yang.
Don't even know his name.
And Andrew Yang. Yeah, it was super close. I was close. Andrew
Super
Young. I
close.
was super
Yeah.
close.
Very close.
Anyways, he was pushing that if he gets elected, he was going to make it a requirement that anybody that joins the police force will have to have at minimum, like I think he said, like a brown belt in
Oh,
jiu-jitsu
really?
or something like that. Like it was gonna be because it's such a good de-escalator. Like it neutralizes the threat. You submit them, but to the point where you learn respect for this
Right.
type of neutralizing a threat. And it's not really, you're not like giving traumatic brain injury. Basically, you're immobilizing them, you're submitting them, or you're choking them out, but you're also
Well, that's
letting them go
interesting
after you've
because,
choked them out.
like what with my example of like the training that they give the drill sergeants, they train them that too, to subdue people without having to use lethal force. But that's the problem is that these positions of authority, like we've talked about it, like you see it in even like pastors of churches, you see it in people in large organizations. It
Totally.
attracts this narcissistic, power hungry, like I'm in control and no matter what, I will control you. And I'm not saying everyone is that way, but we've all met it. Like I
But it's
was
alluring.
I was talking to my wife last night, and there was a police officer in my small town that was known for just being a dickhead. And there was somebody that had an altercation with him, and he put a giant breadboard in his truck. It said the guy's name on it, said what he thought of him, and he drove around for years with it like that. And everyone knew it. And you know what? He's not here anymore. And but he got
He's
called out.
dead.
Like, and he pooped where he ate. And like I think
Right.
that we need more of calling out in a way that is, less
What
immature.
did it say, Jordan? What did the sign say? I don't
It said
remember.
officer so and so is a dickhead, and then had like his badge number and a bunch of other, like, I mean, it was like you could have found his house by just finding this truck. That's how, like, and it was everywhere, and it was not a small sign. It was taller than the truck, and it was the entire bed of the truck, and they drove it all over town with that in it all the time. And
Oh man,
That's hilarious. I'm
that's
surprised
some
he didn't
police
like.
accountability on a very
Yeah.
right,
micro level.
it's like, you know, maybe
We're gonna hold
maybe
this guy
people need to
accountable.
have a little more, like, knowing that it's gonna hurt. Like, you know, I'm not out to like
Well,
ruin someone's
it's
life or anything, and but I've met that cop. The dude wasn't wrong. Like, it wasn't wrong on the truck.
it's just what's surprising to me is like in my job working in healthcare, it's so easy. It's so easy to get in like
Yeah.
malpractice, to get sued. It's so easy to
Mhm.
get to have severe and quick um, punishment by your boards. You have national boards, you have state boards, you have all these different people, you have all these different advocacies to protect patient rights, HIPAA, all these different things where if you breathe wrong, you could get in trouble. But within law enforcement, it feels like they have a kind of a shield that's allowing, and maybe not allowing them, but reinforcing some negative kind
Yeah.
of behaviors.
So,
So
Austin, I do have a question for you, and I'm curious your answer on this, and
Yeah.
maybe I'll get some flack for this.
we could
Like,
throw some shower thoughts out there after
is
this.
something that I've had said to me, with two things. Number one is when I've asked this question, like when things like this come up, not necessarily to this degree. I think a lot of this is to this degree because everyone was stuck in their house for a while, and they just are like, riot, sure. But
Mhm.
I mean, sadly, but I think that things are people are rising up for the right reason. But I've had these people say to me like, "You'll never know." Like if I ask like, "How can I like how are you? How can I understand this? How can I feel? How can I be a help?" They're like, "You'll never know." Like that, just kind of that cold shoulder. Um, I want to know. I want to know what I can do to help. The other thing that I've heard said, I've seen it in multiple memes that is bothersome to me, is if you say nothing, then you're conceding that you're okay with all of this. And I think to that I'd say there's a lot of really busy people that literally don't have time to say much. But what is like something that's really simple that somebody could do that isn't necessarily doing nothing and
Mhm. Yeah, that's such a good question. I'm glad that you asked that. I think, yeah, I have a few thoughts. I mean, I think on one level, like when you're talking about, so like, it sounds like you're saying that like you would maybe say something to a person of color in your life to be like, how can I help or what can I do? And like the response is kind of like, you
Yeah.
can't know. Um, I think for one thing, like we as white people need to really grow our tolerance for that kind of a thing. Like for us to not like I think we struggle with even just like conversations about this, and this will kind of get to your second point about like the staying silent versus doing something. Like what do you say? How do you interact? I think white people, we really really struggle with this because it's hard to like not know how to be right about it, like to feel like we can't get it right, we don't have an answer, we can't make anybody happy, like how do we get there? And I think that can be really frustrating, and I think that it's actually like an important practice when it comes to a lot of things, but like when you're in a position of privilege and like we're talking about race right now, like as a white person talking about race, it's really important that we just get used to like we're not going to be right, we're not going to figure it out, we're not going to have a good
Yeah.
answer. Like I could get, like people of color could listen to this podcast and criticize us for 12 different things, and like that's okay, like great, like let tell me what's up, I'll
Yeah.
listen, I'll hear you. And also like you might have a different perspective than like another friend of mine who's black. Like black people are not a monolith, they don't all have the exact same experience. So like we have to, I think, develop this muscle of like tolerating being wrong, tolerating not being able to be right, even when we try really hard, and just
Mm.
like being a sounding board, being like a receptacle of people of color's anger, frustration. I think if you start to build personal relationships and you like have people in your life that are black and you already know them on a personal level and you're friends with them, then like it's a
Yeah,
little bit easier to have a conversation about like, what can I do? How can I help? Like, okay, I'm trying to work through this, but like if you need space, you don't have to talk to me about it right now if that's just not comfortable. Like it's easier to do that as
for
you know
sure.
people. And then you also like get a bigger sample of like what do different people think, because like some black people are gonna hate half of what I said and some would think it's great. Like we have different opinions on
Which is
things. So anyway, just like I think that's really important, is like that feeling of like we're not going to get it right, and that's part of what I think we're called to in this situation,
That's
is
good.
to
That's
like
so good. I like
show
that.
up and be able to be wrong and be able to like be a sounding board, or like even just like a receptacle for other people's anger and frustration sometimes. Like it doesn't feel fair personally, but I think in the bigger context it's like that's kind of what we have to do if we care about our fellow person and we care about, you know, dismantling white
yeah. So if I
supremacy.
could summarize, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but just like to further bring that down into simple is like being ready to not have an answer and just listen. And being okay with
Yeah.
that. I mean, what it sounds like you're explaining to me, I've experienced a lot of people who have died, and a lot of people who have gone through like multiple like grieving situations. It sounds very similar. Like you wouldn't walk into a
Mhm.
funeral and be like, "Dude, what's wrong?" Like you you wouldn't walk in and
Mhm.
try to make light of the situation or make a joke, unless you knew them really, really well and knew that they're okay with that. Um,
Right.
but in a lot
Right.
of those situations, the only thing that you can do is just show up and sit down and listen and ride the roller coaster of emotion.
Yeah, Jordan, I think that's really beautiful, really well said. I think that like thinking about it, I really think in general, like our country as a whole needs to go through a grieving process when it comes to race. And I think thinking about it in terms of like an individual person that's like grieving something and how you have to approach them. And you just have to show up with this idea of like, I'm not going to get it right. I'm going to try. I'm going to do something kind of like maybe awkward. And like, if you're mad at me or you're sad or I don't help, then like, I'm like, that's
Hmm.
okay. Like I don't expect much more of you. And I think when we approach, you know, black people or the black community in general with this, I think like that's a really good analog to be like, you know, we should also be grieving too. Like we're grieving in a way. And like, this is like tragic and I've been grieving. And yet I know that like my grief isn't the same as my black friend's grief, or like
Right.
a lot of different people. I, yeah, so like yeah, I think that's a really good analog. And I think the other thing I would say, like kind of to the second part of your question, is like yeah, like showing up and listening. um I think you have to kind of be aware of like, you know, your medium. If you're all over social media all the time like spouting all kinds of stuff, then like that's probably like, if that's your daily life, then like that's probably
Yeah.
your venue to try to have some solidarity and say something. Like it might be weird if you're like on social media all the time, but also like social media is so hard. I'm not on it. I think I've been really focused on, I mean, I am on, like I have a Facebook, I have an Instagram. I'm not on it very often. I don't like, I don't feel like it's like a part of my like
We're aware you're not.
conversation. um I know. Yeah, you tried to message me today on Facebook. No, no luck whatsoever. I was like, oh, message. But yeah, I think that like being with the people in your life, and even like I think when people say like being silent is the same as upholding this or whatever, I think that that's like it's fair. It doesn't mean that you need to like put a bunch of stuff
Yeah.
on Instagram or like go do a public speech, but it's like when you're talking with people in your life and you know they dismiss the murder or like white supremacy or don't understand what white privilege is, like first of all like you can learn about these things. I think learning and listening is
Yeah.
really important. And then it's like maybe it's your mom and you just have a conversation with your mom instead of like being
That
quiet and
makes
being like
that makes a
okay I don't
lot
really
more
agree with
sense.
that.
Like
Like
that makes me feel way better about that. And thinking it in that light. I guess I hadn't thought about it that small. Like I was thinking they were like, well, if you don't go riot or you don't like speak out or you don't make some public speech that you're against it or something, that it's like that. The thing that I would remind people too during times like this, like having gone through that, like using that grief analog of the funeral and all that, people don't know what to say in situations of high emotion. They say really dumb things, and it doesn't always mean they mean bad. Like, there's gonna be people that say some really dumb stuff that actually mean good through this situation, and I would just remind people, like, number one, you might hear someone say something like that to you, but number two, you might be that person, and you just like be really careful
yeah.
what you say,
Yeah,
and,
that's good.
and be okay and apologize if you're an idiot. You know, like I'm sure I've said super dumb
And
things.
be yeah, and I would say like if you're a white person, like be okay with being saying the dumb thing. Like as much as you plan it and try really hard, like you still might say
Yeah,
the dumb thing. And that's actually
yeah,
practice is like saying something regardless. And like you can always preface like, especially if you're in a situation with people of color, you can preface it by saying, like, I don't know if this is right, or I feel kind of worried about this, but I want to give some solidarity. Like I care about you all. I'm thinking this. I don't know if that's good.
yeah.
You know, like you can preface it all you want, and that's like actually a really helpful practice. But it's like at the end of the day, you still might say the wrong thing. And like our practice of just showing up and letting that be okay that we're wrong and letting it be part of the experience, I think
Well,
is
and being
is
willing
really
to
important.
being
The way
willing to
Yeah,
be wrong, like not being so sold on your opinion that like all of a hey, tomorrow my opinion might change. Um, but this is how I feel.
it's important.
Um,
Dude, Austin, thank you so much, bro, for coming on, man. Really appreciate it.
thank you.
Super fun.
Really
Do you have time? We're gonna throw a couple real quick little TILs and shower thoughts your way, okay?
on my way. Let's hear them.
Yeah, buddy.
you start off,
Okay,
Curtis.
so my first. Today I learned this was interesting. I had no idea it was this high. Today I learned the world record for the most number of nonstop push-ups is 10,507
What?
by a gentleman from Japan. Yeah, it was achieved in October of 1980, and no one has beaten it since,
I
according
want
to
to
the Guinness Book
see.
of
I
World
want to see
Records.
his form.
I
Yeah,
want to see how
yeah.
good
I
those
want to see the
push-ups were. I
form
know.
because I've seen people that are
Yeah,
like, I'm setting a push-up
yeah,
record, and like, that ain't no push-up. Like you're not making the
I know.
standard here. Oh,
All right,
yeah,
you
I
got one?
do. Um, Today I learned in the 17th century, a man named Lazarus, it looks like Colorado, pretty sure it's not, was convicted of murder. He had a parasitic conjoined twin and successfully argued that his death would kill his twin, an innocent man, and he was pardoned.
That's
Wait, what,
amazing. That's
He
the
had a
amazing.
he had a
conscious? Like
conjoined I don't know. I mean,
full twin or like one of those like little like
it probably
growth
was like a
twins? It's like
growth
not a real
twin, but I mean, think of it back then. People didn't know.
I bet it probably had like legs and arms, but it wasn't
It
like
says
awake.
parasitic, yeah. So it doesn't.
right parasitic. What does that mean? That sounds
So
creepy.
basically, it wasn't contributing. Maybe it was just sucking his life force. um,
Right,
so like on Harry Potter when Voldemort's living on the back of the
Oh
egg.
yeah,
right,
Probably
right.
something like that.
gross.
But today I learned that the U.S. government only decided to give citizenship to Native Americans in 1924.
Oof.
I'm surprised
Wow.
by that.
Wow. Today I learned a restaurant in Bangkok has been constantly cooking and serving from the same soup for 45 years, a form of perpetual stew. Like they just
Oh
keep
my gosh, delicious.
adding to it.
Cooking it, adding.
That's
45.
Interesting.
that's I don't know how I feel about
I
that.
don't think it's the same soup
Yeah.
then, but I don't know. Okay,
What
I
about
only had two shower thoughts, so I only had two TILs, so I'm gonna hit my shower thoughts now. All right, so at some point, late show hosts like Jimmy Fallon, Jimmy Kimmel, yada yada yada. At some point, late show hosts are gonna have to admit that the only thing that differentiates them from YouTubers is their budget.
Yeah.
It's the same thing.
Well,
yeah.
funny thing, if I can find the link to this, I will put it in our show notes. But a guy did a comparison. It was the film theory guy, the guy that does all the Rick and Morty stuff and everything. By the way, we should watch that after this. Uh,
Yes.
but he did like a comparison of ratings for the late night hosts
Mhm.
versus people
Mhm.
who on YouTube and their ratings and like compared the rise and fall of both and who did worse and then
Yeah.
grades them based on how they did because all of a sudden they did their own home studios.
Yeah.
It is it
Yeah.
is
Right. Right.
alarming and all like late night talk at least if not all network television should be shaking in their boots right now after everyone
Because
went
they did
home
terrible.
and couldn't film in studios anymore because people are doing a better job on a $0 budget than these guys are doing with
Yeah.
millions of dollars.
I don't doubt it.
Interesting.
Okay,
Yeah, that makes
you got
Oh, yeah,
another
for sure.
shower thought, Jordan?
The unemployment office is understaffed. Let that sink in.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Okay, every year, history class will get harder and harder.
It's true. Especially this year. What happened in 2020? I don't remember.
Added a lot. Okay, I only got one more shower
Truman
thought.
eventually figures out that he's in a show, but still doesn't know that he's in a movie.
That's good.
That's good. That's good. Okay, this is just. I think it should just. I don't know. It's like a reasonable thing. But I think body cams for civilians might work better than body cams for police officers.
I think that this whole situation proved that. They essentially had a body cam.
Right.
And
well, except for
they just
except
popped
for that,
it out.
It would
there was
help.
more than one person that filmed it. They threatened the first person that stopped, and then 2 other people filmed it.
I guess that's what cell phones are, though, now.
Right.
Wikipedia is what people imagine the internet as in the 80s. Like, that's as far as they thought.
Right.
Yeah. And now they just make fun of it. Like, oh, it's not worth it.
Yeah.
It's not a good source.
Oh,
except for Michael Scott.
Right,
Michael Scott really sticks up for Wikipedia.
Scott's the best. Guys, thank you so much for coming on. Austin, you're a pleasure as always, brother. Appreciate you, man. And
thank you so much for having me,
everybody out there, thanks for listening to Test Normal. Let us know what you like. Let us know what you don't like. Subscribe.
Tell us how dumb we are. Tell us all the dumb things that we said, please.
Yeah, we like it.
We're good about it.
All right, guys. Hope you have a fantastic week. And peace out.
See you guys. Wait, I gotta find the outro. Here it is.